Hello, everyone. Welcome back. When you hear Viking, you probably picture large, muscular warriors, strong and fierce, ready to take on any enemy. But where did they actually come from? Today, we'll tell the story of their origins and the mightiest Viking tribes. Listen all the way through, and if you enjoy it, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more great stories. Chapter 1: Dawn of Wind and Ice. Before the white square sails of the northern seafarers ever cleaved the waves, before the name Viking was etched onto the wind-worn runestones, the north lay in silent stillness, a realm where the wind blew out of season, the sun rose at unpredictable hours, and snow could fall in midsummer, as if the old northern gods were toying with time itself. It was a land without a name. No one yet spoke of Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. The ideas of nations, borders, and frontiers were unknown. Only endless pine forests, brooding ice-capped mountains, and narrow fjords' long scars carved deep into the rock stretched across the landscape. People lived there quietly, sparsely, and resiliently, like moss clinging to stone. They kept no written chronicles of their own birth, but they did have fire. They had stories. They had memories shared on long winter nights, when the wind howled through wooden shutters, and the flickering hearth was the only thing that held back the dark. Those early northern folk, yet unnamed Vikings, lived in small, scattered bands. They gathered by thawing streams, on thin grass plains, or on low mountain slopes where snow did not last year-round. They hunted deer, fished icy seas, foraged forest berries. They stayed wary of great bears, and perhaps even more so, of one another. Because when no law existed beyond one's own strength, survival could mean knowing when to fight and when to flee. And as in all wild frontiers, where humans dwell long enough, tribes form. Not by decree or flag, but around a hearth's embers, at a birthplace, beside a familiar shallow river, on a rocky ground marked by ancestral footsteps. The first tribe recorded by history, not in written word, but in archaeological artifacts, was a farming and fishing community along the western shores of the Scandinavian peninsula. These people did not know they were laying the foundations of a future warrior society. They only knew how to sow seeds in damp earth, haul fish from the cold sea, and carve strange images into boulders, what we now call prehistoric Norse petroglyphs. Many of these carvings show longships, shield bearers, or rituals whose meanings we cannot fully decode. Why the pre-Viking people carved these scenes remains unclear, but we can surmise they recorded what mattered most to them: the sea, warfare, faith, and the spirit within. Over time, these groups became permanent villages, perhaps just a handful of simple wooden huts around a clearing. Each winter survived without succumbing to the cold or to disease was a triumph. Children who lived through their first snowfall were seen as blessings from the gods. Elders who could still sit by the fire and weave tales were living memory for the entire community. One of the oldest excavated settlements, Ribe, in what is now Denmark, had by the 8th century become a small trading hub where northern folk exchanged furs, dried fish, and stone axes for salt, metal, and glass beads from southern lands. No one there called themselves Vikings. They were simply coastal dwellers who used boats to find food, trade goods, and sometimes opportunities to raid. The term Viking, literally one who goes out to raid, first appears in 9th century Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. But before becoming raiders, they were farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, parents, sorcerers, and keepers of the sacred flame. From these villages, chieftains emerged, not by vote or lineage, but by strength and wisdom. A man, or even a woman, brave enough to guide their people through famine, wise enough to negotiate with neighbors, and fierce enough to cleave a wolf's skull with an axe became leader. Alliances then formed. 3 villages, 5 villages, a dozen united for defense, trade, and shared rights, honoring Odin, Freyja, or the sea god Aegir. Each tribe bore its own emblem, its own runic script style, its own war chants, and its own founding legend passed down through generations. As populations grew and resources began to dwindle, simmering conflicts flared. The northern tribes changed. They no longer sought merely sustenance, they hungered for land. Not just shelter, they craved renown. From that yearning arose the first generation of Viking warriors. None were born warriors. They were children, taught to handle an axe rather than a pen, trained to run on ice, scale mountains in snowstorms, and sleep under the stars until the night wind no longer frightened them. They heard tales of Valhalla, where fallen heroes would feast and fight forever by the side of the gods. This was no mere fantasy. It was an ideal of life. From that ideal, the Vikings were born. But that tale does not begin today. It unfolds in the chapters to come. In the ancient North, there was something very different from the rest of humankind. It wasn't the climate, the landscape, or the snowstorms that swept in at night like invisible blades. It was the way they looked up at the sky. When the Greeks gazed upward, they saw the stars forming the shapes of gods and myths of love and tragedy. The Egyptians saw Ra, Horus, and the sun's daily journey across the heavens as a grand chariot. But the Northerners did not look to the sky merely to find divinity. They believed the gods walked among them, dwelling in the forests, in the stones, in the wind, and even in their own blood. Viking faith was never written down. There was no Bible, no fixed dogma. Everything was passed verbally from the old storytellers huddled by the hearth, their fur cloaks wrapped tightly, eyes dim with age, yet voices as clear as though recounting events of yesterday. They believed that Yggdrasil, the world tree, lay at the universe's center. This was no ordinary tree, but a colossal ash whose roots plunged into the realms of the dead and whose branches stretched into the heavens. From its limbs, 9 worlds hung like frost-glazed spheres. Among them were Asgard, the home of the gods, and Midgard, the world of humankind. Not everyone dared speak the names of these worlds. Blacksmiths, shepherds, and even warriors often referred to them simply as the place of the gods, or, more vaguely, somewhere beyond this. The god most spoken of was Odin, lord of war, wisdom, and death. But Odin was unlike Western gods. He was not omnipotent or immortal in any easy sense. He sacrificed one of his eyes for knowledge, hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 nights to learn the runes, and would willingly meet death again in the final battle of the cosmos Ragnarok. Odin embodied a very Viking ideal, sacrifice for something greater. On storm-swept nights, as elders recounted the tale of Odin gouging out his eye, the children sat motionless, small hands clenched, as though their own eyes smarted, not from fear, but from understanding that strength carried its own pain. Next came Thor, Odin's son, god of thunder and protector of humankind against chaos. Thor did not reign aloof upon a throne. He walked among mortals, wielding the heavy hammer Mjolnir, smashing the skulls of great serpents and trampling ice to reach those in need. Whenever thunder rolled through the village, people did not fear it. They believed it was Thor at battle. Children dashed outside, faces upturned, hands clasped in hope. Women burned incense and tossed a handful of sheep's wool into the flames, pleading for his protection. And the men, well, they sharpened their helmets and polished their axes. For war and defense were two sides of the same prayer. Then there was Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and battle, a very different power. She embodied feminine might, not soft or in need of protection. It was said that Freyja could bring the strongest warriors to their knees, not from infatuation, but from awe. When a hero fell, half his soul went to her, the other half to Odin. For the Northmen, death in battle divided glory equally between the god of wisdom and the goddess of courage. But the gods did not live only in stories. They were present in everything. In the spiral carvings on an axe handle, symbols of Yggdrasil. In the wooden cup of mead-shaped, like Fenrir's wolfish head. In the winter sacrificial rite, where the bleating of a goat was accompanied by shouts not just drunk on ale, but believed to be heard by Odin himself. They erected sacred stones, Hurgar, on the village edge, by a spring or atop a mound. On the first day of each week, someone brought an offering, a piece of dark bread, some dried meat, or even an old ring, not out of fear of punishment, but from faith and balance between mortals and gods, between life and death, between day and night. Children learned the names of the gods before they could write their own, for they needed to know who watched over them, who would guide them when death came. And because in every Northborn child, from the moment of birth, lay the seed of a warrior waiting to sprout in the cold and thunder forth across the valleys. Though they lacked a unified language, schools, kings, or kingdoms, the ancient Northerners possessed one thing that made them stronger than any foe. They believed the gods walked with them, not in lofty heavens, but by their side through snow, across seas, in dreams, and in sleepless nights, when a young mother kept vigil by the hearth, waiting for her hunter husband's return. And when the first Viking longships touched England's shores, no one was surprised that they carried warriors armed not only with axes and shields, but with an unbreakable faith. But that is a tale for the future. For now, deep in the dark forests of Scandinavia, a youth stands chopping at a stout oak. He hears the winds howl as Freyja's counsel. He counts his axe swings as Thor counts the beats of war. And in his heart, Odin whispers, "Remember, you do not walk alone." If a stranger from the south wandered into the north in the 7th century, he would see no cities, no stone walls, no grand plazas, and certainly no soaring steeples like those in Rome or Byzantium. Instead, all he would behold were low wooden houses belching smoke from thatched roofs, ringed by pine forests, snow-patchy meadows, and the distant bark of dogs behind simple fences. But do not mistake this plainness for weakness. These villages had learned to endure hundreds of winters, and from these tiny clusters of homes, a warrior culture would rise. A Viking village was never built to a blueprint. It grew in step with nature, near water, on soft ground, with forests close by for game and defense. At its heart stood the longhouse, where families gathered for feasts, ceremonies, storytelling, and decisions that shaped the fate of the entire community. The longhouse was no grand hall. Its thick planks of pine were hand-fitted without nails. Gaps were sealed with clay, seaweed, or moss. The roof lay under a thatch of reeds, layered with sod to keep in warmth and life. Inside, a hearth burned at the center, not only for warmth, but for light, cooking, and bolstering spirits when daylight barely lasted 4 hours. Vikings slept on wooden platforms along the walls. Men, women, children, even dogs pressed close together for warmth. The mingled scents of smoked meat, damp wool, dry straw, and sweat formed the unmistakable fragrance of a living Viking home. At dawn's first mist each morning, no bells tolled, only the ring of axes, chopping wood, butchering fowl, weaving cloth, forging weapons. Idleness was unknown. As soon as a child could stand, he or she was tasked to collect kindling, tend the fire. Every youth, by age 15, had to master the axe, track game, and meet an enemy's gaze without flinching. The martial spirit was not taught in schools, it seeped into daily life. When a boy watched his father resharpen a chipped blade, that was a lesson. When a mother retied her son's leather thong, warning, "Tie it tight so the axe won't slip when your hand is slick with blood," that was training. And whenever a young man set out hunting deer, seeking salt, or joining a summer raid, the village saw him off with a single utterance, "Go," as though Odin watches. No further instruction was needed. That phrase reminded him that every act honored tribe and gods alike. In summer, when the snows melted and rivers freed their paths, villages held tests of skill holmgang. 2 youths, or sometimes a woman and a man, entered a marked circle armed with axe, sword, or even bare hands. The duel was not always to the death, but to prove one's honor. The loser was not weak, but needed more learning. The victor was not haughty, but tasked with upholding the village's reputation in true battle. Though each settlement was remote, isolation was never complete. Villages traded, challenged one another, intermarried, and when needed, allied for war. No king ruled them, but each had a spokesperson, the thane or jarl, who represented them at moot gatherings. There, in face-to-face councils, they decided war, commerce, and even land division by oral vote. No records were kept, no signatures required. Honor was their strongest contract, and an oath was inviolable. Beneath the floorboards of the longhouse lay hidden heirlooms, a strand of southern beads, a scrap of rune-etched cloth, or the head of a broken axe once wielded by an ancestor. "Do you hear it?" a mother would say when the wind blew. That is our forebears speaking. You must keep your promise. The Viking warrior code was rooted not in cold blood, but in tradition. They did not raid merely out of want. They did so to expand their world. They did not kill out of malice. They did so to reclaim lost honor. Thus, when the first Viking warriors pushed off from these small hamlets, they did not think themselves invaders. They believed they were carrying out a mission ordained by gods, ancestors, and fate. But every great journey begins with small steps. The first armor made was only scraps of tanned hide and bent iron strips. The first warship was a hollowed log that would evolve into the longship. And every first warrior was simply a son, a father, a villager in a tiny clearing in the wild woods. They did not know their names would become legend. They only knew to stand in the wind, wipe sweat from their brows, tighten their bootstraps, and keep building, keep living. For they understood this truth. If the village endures, their names will endure too. Chapter 2. When the ocean began to call. There came a time in history when every patch of land seemed too small to hold human yearning. No one knows precisely what made the northern folk accustomed to secluded hamlets amid forests, snowfields, and glaciers look toward the horizon, where the sea had no shore, and the wind carried the salt of distant worlds. Perhaps that winter had lasted too long. Perhaps the soil no longer yielded enough grain. Or perhaps it was a dream told on a long night. A dream of far-flung isles where the sun never set and gold lay hidden in the beach's sands. Whatever the reason, one thing was certain. The ocean called to them. And they answered, not with words, but with wood, sails, and the chorus of oars. The longship, the Vikings' sleek war vessel, did not spring into being overnight. It was the product of generations of trial and error, of countless summers building rafts and interminable winters repairing battered hulls. At first it was merely a hollowed log. Then came oars. Then a square sail. Then the dragon-headed prow, not only for decoration, but to frighten sea spirits and enemies alike. Longships were long, narrow, light, and exceptionally sturdy. They could race swiftly over open water and be hauled ashore with ease. On a favorable wind, one could cover more than 150 kilometers in a single day without stopping at port. Men would sit in line, hands gripping oars, eyes fixed on the sea, laughing in the teeth of storms, because for them, the ocean was not perilous, but a path to destiny. The Vikings' first voyage was not a raid, but an expedition. A handful of young warriors set out with dried provisions, axes, and a small rune-inscribed charm carved by the village seer. They did not know where they would land, only that return with empty hands would brand them as fools. They departed at dawn, while dew still glistened on grass blades and distant dogs barked. Those left behind stood silently on the shore. No tears, no cries, just nods of solemn understanding. If someone must go first, let it be the boldest. And then they returned a month later, bearing a curious fur from western shores, a string of cobalt glass beads traded with strangers in a land called Bretland, later known as England, and strange tales of churches, monasteries, and unguarded towers with gold gleaming within. No one believed every detail, but everyone listened and remembered. The next summer, not one ship set sail, but 3, then 5, then 10. And so began the age of exploration. From the coasts of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, Viking ships ventured across the North Atlantic. They did not always plunder. Often they simply arrived, observed, traded a few goods, and sailed home. But to the Southerners, those sun-bronzed, blonde-haired warriors laughing amid thunder, rowing through the night, became a nameless dread. Early Anglo-Saxon records called them Northmen. Later came Vikinger, an old word meaning those who take to the sea in search of fortune. Not necessarily plunderers, but always adventurers. When they returned, Vikings spoke with fiery breath, describing churches, lands, sheer cliffs, birds that flew only at night, and flocks of sheep that moved in perfect order without shepherds. They whispered these stories under a silent sky, as if astonished they had set foot in another realm. So it was that by flickering firelight, a new generation grew up, children who no longer dreamed only of hunting or defending the village. They dreamed of distant isles, epic sea voyages, and victorious songs echoing through foreign harbors. But not all returned. Some ships vanished, forever lost to storms or struck down in strange lands. Yet in Viking culture, death at sea was an honorable fate. The sail billowed one last time. The dragon head sank beneath the waves, a solemn rite. And when the village learned of such loss, they did not weep, but carved a new symbol into a sacred stone. Each carving was a farewell, a cut into the tribe's memory, and a vow that those who followed would go further. Summer after summer, the Vikings' map expanded, not on paper, but through story. Here was a shallow bay safe to land. There lay hidden reefs best avoided. Beyond lay a monastery with unlocked doors and gold glittering on its altars. But one could also find foreign gods, steel-tipped arrows, heavy armor, and horses twice the size of their own. Vikings kept no written records, but they remembered with blood, with sweat, and with the haunted gaze of survivors. Soon, it was not only men who set sail. Women joined as healers, seers, and even warriors. Children grew up on deck, the wind and waves their constant tutors. Gradually, many Vikings did not return. They settled, built villages in foreign lands, and became seeds of further expansion. From Ribe to Lindisfarne, from Hedeby to the coasts of France, from icy longhouses to stone forts on distant plains. Viking was no longer merely a people. It was a concept, a way of life, an unquenchable thirst for movement. And in the hazy dawn of medieval Europe, the silhouettes of Viking sails began appearing on the horizon, unstoppable. Early on a summer morning, in the year 793, clouds drifted silently across the sky off the north coast of England. Gentle waves lapped the shore, and the sea breeze carried the tang of salt and seaweed. Lindisfarne Priory, perched on a small island off Northumbria's coast, still slumbered amid the soft murmurs of prayer. The monks walked barefoot across the cold stone floor, their hands cradling holy books as they intoned ancient Latin passages unfamiliar to the local tongue. They did not know that offshore, a fleet of ships was stealthily gliding toward them. No one sounded an alarm. No horns were blown. There were no war drums, only the splash of water against hulls and the taut creak of ropes in the morning breeze. The sails, each emblazoned with a red dragon's head, loomed like specters through the mist. The Vikings had arrived. The raid on Lindisfarne is often cited as the opening of the Viking Age in European history. But to the Vikings themselves, it was simply a wildly successful voyage and a test of their methods that exceeded all expectations. They did not realize they were rewriting history. They only knew that the priory held vast stores of gold, lacked defending soldiers, and that the deities of this place offered no protection. Axes whistled as they bit into stone and wood. Shouts of terror mingled with the unfinished prayers. Priceless manuscripts were torn apart. Candles toppled to the floor. They did not come to burn everything. They came to take what they could: gold, silver, wine, fine cloth, anything of value. Then, just as swiftly as they had descended, they withdrew. Within hours, Lindisfarne, the foremost religious center in England at that time, was stripped bare. The raiders slipped away as quietly as they had come, leaving behind a shock the likes of which this land had never known. News spread through Northumbria, then into Mercia, Wessex, and Kent, the small English kingdoms of the day. People did not know what to call their attackers: Northmen, heathens, sea barbarians. No one was certain, only that these strangers struck swiftly, departed swiftly, and obeyed no laws. In his trembling account, Alcuin of York wrote, "We have seen men whose names we had never heard. They wield axes, wear furs on their heads, and their eyes blaze like fire. To them, a church is a treasure vault, not a sacred place." To the Vikings, they were not villains. In their minds, an undefended monastery was an open treasury, and if its god could not protect his own flock, that spoke of weakness, not holiness. After Lindisfarne, Viking warriors widened their scope. They struck Jarrow, then Monk Wearmouth, pushing ever southward. They did not always prevail. Some raids were repelled, ambushes laid against them. But they learned quickly, very quickly. The Vikings were nothing like the professional legions of Rome. They had no permanent generals or uniform equipment, but they possessed flexibility, audacity, and living memory. They knew the coastline like the back of their hands. Their ships could slip up narrow rivers, deep into the hinterland where no one suspected. They attacked at unlikely moments: dawn, storms, even in winter. The English trembled, the monks quaked, and the kings began to negotiate, and that was the turning point. From feared strangers, the Vikings became a power to be reasoned with. Several weaker kingdoms, rather than fight, opted to pay. They called it Danegeld, the Danish tribute, to keep the raiders at bay. Every purse of silver handed over was an admission that we cannot stop you, but we will bribe you to go away. Thus, some Vikings no longer needed to pillage. They only needed to arrive, pitch camp near a village, meet the people's eyes, and wait for the silver. From raiders, they evolved into negotiators. From warriors into traders. What began as small boat parties grew into winter camps across England. They no longer retreated after each raid. They stayed, raised their banners, built dwellings, and called for more ships. And England, once a patchwork of petty realms, began to contain Vikings as part of its reality. Within a few years, some Vikings even took local wives. Mixed offspring were born. Viking camps were formally named. Viking towns were founded. The initial terror gave way to something else: acceptance, assimilation, transformation. For the Vikings, this was an era of unprecedented expansion. No emperors, no maps required. They extended their world by oar strokes and secured it by reputation. And from the icy cliffs of Northumbria, the echo of Viking axes rang ever farther south to the Thames, across the Channel to France and Ireland, and even to lands yet unnamed, Iceland. But that is the story for later chapters. For now, in the misty dawn of ancient England, a local child glimpses a Viking for the first time. The stranger is not wielding an axe. He sits hammering a blade under a lone tree, gently patting the child's hair while a soft smile plays across his lips. They are no longer phantoms from the sea. They are new neighbors. At first, they came and went, like the wind, like the tide. Viking landings on England followed one another in a cycle, much like the harvest. Off to sea in summer, home in winter. Each voyage brought a little more gold, a little more renown, a little more blood, and a few more hard-won lessons. But then there came a moment no one can pinpoint, only that from that day on, the Vikings did not return home. They stayed, not as conquerors, but as builders. From makeshift winter camps of rough wooden huts and hastily woven fences, the Vikings began to put down permanent roots. They laid bricks, hung doors, built livestock pens, and reclaimed fields for farming. One person at a time, one group after another, quietly, without fanfare, yet as relentlessly as successive waves upon the shore. And when the English looked back, they saw part of their realm transformed by northern ways. That land, over time, acquired a curious name: Danelaw, the law of the Danes. There was no royal decree, no crown passed between hands, no parades or flying banners. Only one simple truth. Wherever the Vikings settled, they carried their laws, customs, and worldview with them. Danelaw was not a kingdom, but a patchwork of territories governed by Viking law. It spanned much of eastern and northern England, from the Thames up through Yorkshire, encompassing towns like York, Jorvik, Lincoln, and Leicester. The Vikings did not force locals to adopt their tongue. Instead, they learned the local language. Over time, the two tongues entwined, layering new words, new accents, and fresh names for everyday things, many of which persist in modern English. Sky, egg, knife, window all derive from Old Norse, not textbooks, but daily life in Danelaw. The Vikings built markets. They opened ports. They traded not only gold, but furs, timber, mead, and slaves. Yes, a grim fact. The slave trade formed a significant part of the Viking economy, common in many ancient societies, though never a source of pride. Yet they did more than trade. They tilled the soil, raised cattle, sowed barley, and even began to pay taxes. Where axes and blood once ruled, wells and bakeries took root. Where monasteries were once sacked, shipyards now rose. And children were born with their Viking father's blonde hair and their Anglo-Saxon mother's brown eyes asking, "Who are we?" York, the largest city in Danelaw, blossomed into the foremost Viking cultural hub outside Scandinavia. No longer merely a fortress, it became a thriving town. Bustling markets, churches, smithies, quays, and even rudimentary waste collection. Clad in furs, leather boots, and iron helms, The Vikings of York still recited poetry, played the lyre, and held storytelling contests on moonless nights. Their lives were no longer defined solely by warfare, but by a genuine culture. Fathers teaching runes, mothers teaching knitting, and elders recounting tales of ancestors braving snowstorms. But Danelaw was no paradise. Resentment lingered among the native English. Skirmishes flared in the dark between lords who refused to adapt. And though many Vikings desired peace, fresh raiding bands, fresh from the sea with axes and fire, rekindled old fears. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Saxon kings to the south, like Alfred the Great, began reorganizing their defenses, codifying laws, and meeting the Vikings with strategy. They built fortifications, raised mobile armies, and learned to fight like the Norse. This conflict grew beyond sword against axe. It became a contest of two systems of governance. And so, as Danelaw took shape, England was forever altered. No longer the land of a single people, it became a realm where multiple bloodlines mixed, multiple laws converged, and old place names blurred into new forms. Children raised in Danelaw no longer saw Vikings as invaders, but as fathers, mothers, teachers, and trading neighbors. They named their towns with blended tongues: Northwick, Scunthorpe, Grimsby Anglo, and Norse entwined like their own heritage. Yet no one knew how long this fragile balance would last. For the Vikings never truly rested. Once Danelaw stood secure, their eyes turned farther, south to France, west to Ireland, and beyond to a fabled land called Vinland. They never stopped, not from greed, but because the Viking spirit was not possession, but discovery. But that is the tale of the next chapter. For now, in a small Danelaw village, a child carves his first runes into wood. My father came from the sea. My mother was born here. I am of both worlds. And with those words, a new chapter in Viking history begins. Chapter 3. Foreign Harbors, New Banners. Aflutter. When the spring winds began to blow along England's western shores, a thin mist settled over the sea like an unfurled blanket. On the calm water, a few Viking ships slid silently by, their axes clinking, timbers creaking, and eyes fixed on the horizon where the ocean stretched on without end. These warriors were no longer wide-eyed youths seeking first glory. They had grown into seasoned fighters. The blades that once dripped blood were now freshly sharpened. And this time, their course was set for a land they had only heard of in tales. Ireland. To the northerners, Ireland was shrouded in legend. It lacked great stone fortresses like those in England, yet it was divided into hundreds of petty kingdoms, each with its own king, its own laws, and tangled kinship networks like gnarly roots in the earth. The Irish had poetry, stringed instruments, grand religious festivals, and above all, monasteries brimming with gold, precious manuscripts, and sacred images. But they had no battle fleets and no coastal defenses. It was an unwritten invitation. Viking raiders made their first landfall in Ireland in the late 8th century, touching down at places like Lambay, Wexford, and the future site of Dublin. At first, they came, plundered, and withdrew as they had in England. But as ever, they returned, and this time they stayed. The Norse built fortified encampments called long forts, both military bases and hubs of trade. One of those long forts would grow into a great city, Dublin. Then, a muddy riverside stretch on the Liffey, Dublin was transformed by the Vikings into a bustling port. They dug channels, drove wooden piles, constructed quays, and turned the settlement into a center for cloth, ale, salt, furs, and grimly slaves. Dublin became Western Europe's largest slave market. An unsettling truth that nonetheless reflected the age. The Irish fought back. Skirmishes broke out. Some raids were repelled, and on occasion the Vikings were driven ashore. Yet they persevered. Bit by bit, they ceased merely to fight. They married local women, learned the Gaelic tongue, and wove themselves into Irish kinship networks. Some Viking chieftains became vassals to Irish kings, while retaining authority over their coastal strongholds. The Irish called these newcomers Gal Gaedhil, foreigners with the spirit of the Gaels, and so a new generation was born. Golden-haired warriors speaking Irish, worshipping both Norse gods and Christ. Once more, the Vikings became part of the land they had invaded. At roughly the same time, across the channel in Francia, the sound of axes and sails reached the Frankish shores. Unlike England or Ireland, Francia was a powerful kingdom with a standing army, stone castles, and an intricate tax system. Yet its river cities proved tempting targets. The Vikings discovered that the Seine served as a direct highway to Paris. From 845 onward, bands of Norsemen rode upriver to the very gates of the Frankish capital. Paris trembled. King Charles the Bald had no choice but to pay them 7,000 silver pounds to withdraw, a staggering sum. The Vikings accepted the tribute, but they also memorized every bend of the river as though mapping hidden treasure. They returned in greater numbers, with swifter ships and better organization. They no longer simply raided. They established camps, built fortifications, laid down quays, and began demanding land rights. In 911, King Charles the Simple did the unthinkable. He granted a stretch of territory in what is now Normandy to a Viking leader named Rollo. In return, Rollo pledged to defend the coast against further Viking incursions. Thus the Norsemen became counts, holding fiefs, defending the realm, and even taking on Frankish names. That region came to be known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. There the Vikings adopted the French language, married into the nobility, and trained their heirs to serve as knights. From Ireland to France, the Vikings brought not only axes, but an extraordinary adaptability. They understood that survival did not require forsaking their essence. They assimilated without dissolving, built without forgetting how to fight. Their descendants, the Normans, would go on to shape the grandest campaigns in European history. One of those descendants, William, Duke of Normandy, would conquer England in 1066. But that is a tale for another day. For now, in a simple riverside house in Rouen, a boy hefts a wooden sword in play. His mother is French. His father, a Viking scion. He learns both tongues as he grows. Outside, church bells toll, but through the mist on the Seine, the soft echo of ancestral oars still whispers on the breeze. One thing never changed in Viking blood. They could not stay still. Even after they had land, villages, children, and peaceful lives on shores once held by their enemies, there were always Vikings, old and young, men and sometimes women, sitting by the quayside, eyes on the sea, fingers turning over rune-carved knives, as if waiting for a summons from some distant horizon. And then that call finally came. Around the mid-9th century, a Norwegian sailor named Nadod set out from Norway toward the Faroe Islands. But en route, his ship was driven off course. Winds carried him northwest into a thick fogland where no birds flew, and the sea lay flat and silent. Only snow-capped mountains and barren rock as far as the eye could see. Nadod called this place Snaeland, the land of snow. Today, we know it as Iceland. At first, no one dreamed of settling there. Iceland was empty, just icebound lakes, wind-swept pastures, and steaming hot springs like the breath of slumbering gods. But to the Vikings, this land was not a limit, but an opportunity. Soon, those wishing to escape taxes, feuds, or kin strife left Norway with their families for Iceland. They brought tents, livestock, seed grain, and memories of the old gods. On that cold rock, they forged a brand new society. No kings, no princes, no lords. They founded the Althing, Iceland's assembly of law, one of the world's oldest parliamentary bodies. No throne, only standing stones where people met each year to adjudicate disputes, parcel out land, and recount their ancestral sagas. In this way, Iceland was not conquered, but born. But Iceland was not the edge of the world. Another Viking would push farther still. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for 3 years over a killing, chose not to stay and face punishment, but to sail on. He crossed ice-choked seas to the west and discovered a vast land of snow-capped mountains and endless ice, yet with sheltered southern coasts green enough to graze cattle and sheep. To entice settlers, he gave it a more appealing name, Greenland. Remarkably, it worked. Many families, Iceland's relentless winters and poor soil followed Eric to Greenland. There, they lived in stone houses, raised short-season barley, kept cattle, sheep, and reindeer. A Viking community flourished, hundreds of miles from home, undisturbed and at peace. And then, one day, Eric's son Leif Erikson heard stories of yet another land, a place where Norse drifters had once washed ashore, where forests grew tall, timber abounded for shipbuilding, and strange fruits ripened wild. Leif, a warrior who also believed in dreams, set sail and voyaged farther than any Viking before him. And he reached it. Not Africa, not Asia, but the far edge of the Atlantic. He landed on what is now Canada's eastern coast and established a settlement he called Vinland, the land of wild grapes. Vinland offered woods, rivers, and meadows, and its own people. They were unlike any Norse had met. Brown-skinned, wielding wooden lances, superb walkers, living in tribal villages. The two cultures met, neither immediate enemies nor instant friends. Few Vikings lived in Vinland. With no reinforcements and skirmishes escalating, they eventually withdrew to Greenland. Vinland remained only in Saga's no lasting colony, but proof that Vikings reached North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. Yet Vikings did not crave fame. They wrote no books to immortalize themselves. They lived. They told their tales. They carved names into stone and left it to their heirs to understand. He went where none before had gone. And now we know that land is real. When night fell on Iceland's own shores, By a fire near black lava fields, an elder told his grandson of distant realms. The boy asked, "Did you ever see Vinland?" The old man shook his head. "No, but I have seen the man who saw it." In the boy's eyes flickered the firelight, the echo of waves, and an unspoken vow. "One day, I will go further still." Not every life is written down in words. Not every victory is carved into runestones. And not every warrior is remembered by name. But for the Vikings, the most important thing was never to be enshrined in history books. It was to be retold, to become part of the tales passed around the hearth fire, from father to son, from grandmother to grandchild, from one generation that braved the waves to the next that learns to grip the oar for the first time. Viking culture does not live in castles. It lives in the whistle of wind across wooden planks, in the grooves etched on an axe haft, in the chant that rises when the oars dip into the sea, and in the eyes of those who wait on the shore. The Vikings may not have possessed sprawling histories like the Romans, but they had epics. The Eddas, the Saga's long narratives handed down over centuries in verse, images, and symbols. A saga often begins with gentle pace. There was once a man who lived in a land of endless snow. He had a son who dreamed of a white horse flying across the sky. And then the story unfolds in dreams and deeds, in slaying and love, in betrayal, and sometimes even in the simple sharing of a winter's meal. These were not mere stories. They were lifelines. At festivals, when winter held sway and ships could not sail, the Vikings gathered around the fire. Elders recounted campaigns of old. Middle-aged folk spoke of newly built vessels and cargoes waiting for spring. And the children sat enthralled, as if every word became part of their very being. In those tales, the gods always walked among them. Odin wandering, the knight in his gray cloak, one eye veiled, listening to the living and guiding the dead. Thor hammer in hand, shattering storms and reminding all that courage is not measured by muscle, but by the will to defend. Freya fierce and radiant, holding life and death in her very grasp. The Vikings did not beseech the gods. They conversed with them as facets of their own souls. Every battle was Odin's test. Every dream, a sign from Freya. And every newborn child, a fresh chance for the gods to try their world once more. Viking culture was also woven into objects. A dragon-headed brooch, not just to fasten a cloak, but to declare, "I am the descendant of those who rode the waves." A rune-inscribed stone, not merely a symbol, but a saga distilled into a whisper that lasts forever. A simple wooden bowl, holding a meal, but also bearing the memory of the mother who washed it in glacier-cold streams. Even death, for the Vikings, was part of their tapestry. A warrior's passing was not an end, but the opening of a new chapter in Valhalla, the hall, where souls feast by day and fight by night, awaiting Ragnarok, a Viking funeral. Whether on a burning ship or laid to rest with sword and shield, was never a farewell, but a send-off. No tears were shed. An axe tapped a shield 3 times. No shout was raised. Only the quiet vow, "We'll meet again on that final battlefield." And then, gradually, as voyages grew fewer, as lands were parceled out, as peace of sorts became tolerable, The Vikings no longer needed to swing an axe to prove themselves. They began to write. Though belatedly, they inked runes on goatskin, then adopted the Latin alphabet. They recorded sagas, events, kings' names, villages, and even love stories. From warriors, they became storytellers. Thus, the Viking world, like every culture, began to evolve. Children learned to read before learning to wield an axe. Elders spoke of sea expeditions as if recounting a beautiful dream. Old longships were hauled ashore and re-erected for ancestor worship. And the weathered wooden statue of Odin stood alongside the cross. Not a collapse, but a transformation. The world may have forgotten many names, but Viking culture did not die. It seeped into language, into place names, into living legends as enduring as the sea wind. It lives on in the words we speak: sky, window, husband, law. It lives in the way a young person stands before the sea, not in fear, but in wonder. And on a winter's evening in the 21st century, when someone lights a candle, opens a book, and reads the first line of an ancient saga, there was once a man who lived in a land of endless snow. Then, in that moment, the Viking world is reborn. No need for warships, no need for trophies, just someone who remembers and tells the tale again. Chapter 4. When the sails no longer caught the wind. No sound announced an age's end. No door slammed shut between axe and oath. Decline like nightfall crept in, not with thunder, but with silence. For the Vikings, the twilight of their era did not arrive in a single defeat. It stretched on season by season, generation by generation, like the dying glow of a hearth fire on a ship's return. At the dawn of the 11th century, the Vikings still stood strong. They held lands, kings, armies, and even a North Sea emperor of England, Canute the Great, the Dane. Under his rule, the North Sea Empire spanned Denmark, Norway, England, and parts of Sweden, a dominion unparalleled in northern history. Yet that light did not last. When Canute died in 1035, the empire cracked from within. His sons squabbled for power. None could hold the vast territories together. England slipped back into native hands. Denmark fell into strife, and Norway fractured. Then came 1066, and the Normans' Viking descendants returned to England under William the Conqueror. But they came not as Vikings, but as a people transformed in language, faith, customs, and ambition. The original Vikings were replaced by their own evolved heirs. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the old Viking homelands, an even deeper change was unfolding. Conversion. From the 10th century onward, Christianity spread across the north, first in small pockets, then embraced by kings as a tool of rule, and finally crowned as state religion. Temples to the Norse gods were torn down. Rune-carved stones were recarved with crosses. Pagan rites were banned, supplanted by Christmas and Easter. The songs that once praised Odin, Thor, and Freya were replaced by church bells and Latin hymns. Not all resisted. Many welcomed the promise of peace tired of endless wars, famine, and voyages that might be their last. Who could blame them if a new faith offered eternal rest without a lifetime of battle? The new Viking generation no longer lived as their forebears had. They settled, they farmed, learned to read, built churches. They laid down axes and took up quills. They began writing history in Latin instead of runes. And when asked, "What did your grandfather do?" a young man would reply, neither proudly nor sorrowfully, "He sailed away and never returned. But now I have fields, a wife, and peace." In those years, modern nations took shape. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, once scattered realms, centralized power, codified laws, levied taxes, and organized standing armies like their European neighbors. Vikings accustomed to boundless freedom were drawn into the machinery of the nation-state. Those who once lived by the sea now lived by its laws. Warriors who roamed deep forests now paid land taxes. And the cry of "set sail" slowly gave way to "stay ashore." By the late 11th century, the legendary longships no longer ventured out to sea. Some were dismantled. Some rotted away. Some were buried, so future generations might unearth them and wonder who once dared voyage so far on mere wood and wind. There was no grand farewell to the Viking Age, no final salute, only the hush of time passing. Fishing hamlets, rune-carved stones, and place names slowly blanketed by moss, by dust, by newer words and newer voices. They were no longer called Vikings, but Norsemen, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes. Yet on a winter's night, by a flickering hearth, someone still tells the tale. Long ago, our ancestors sailed to the world's edge, and they feared nothing. Listen closely in the silent night, after the wind has died, and you may hear an oar whisper across the water, not from any ship afloat, but from memory itself. When history turned to the Middle Ages, people often spoke of knights, the church, great stone castles, and the Crusades. The names of kings, popes, and lords were written in red ink in the chronicles. The Vikings no longer appeared as a storm. They did not land on shores. They did not sack monasteries. They did not pitch tents by rivers, as in earlier centuries. But to think they vanished, this is merely a narrow view from a map. The Vikings did not retreat. They merged into the flow of Europe, silently, steadfastly, and carrying the seeds of a culture that once reached farther than any of its contemporaries. In England, after the Norman conquest of 1066, the Normans themselves, descendants of Vikings in France, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom fell. But that collapse was not total erasure. Old Norse continued to blend into English, leaving hundreds of words we still use every day: sky, anger, egg, knife, window, husband. In York once, Jorvik Viking houses stood for centuries afterward. They were renamed, passed to new owners, yet retained their simple wooden frames, low doorways, and central hearths. Generation after generation, locals recounted Odin's deeds as one might speak of a distant forebear, no longer worshipped, but never forgotten. In Ireland, many Viking descendants became merchants, smiths, and sailors. They no longer carried axes, yet they still went to sea, still traded, still used the port organization methods their ancestors had brought to found Dublin. The city's markets, now alive with cars and electric lights, still occupy the sites of old Viking docks. In France, the Normans no longer spoke Old Norse. They spoke French. Yet they retained the Viking spirit in governance and warfare. William the Conqueror, Rollo's air-defeated herald at Hastings, and founded a new dynasty in England. From that moment on, England bore Germanic roots, Latin roots, and Viking blood a blend, but a powerful one. And in the bloody Crusades, when Western knights marched into the Middle East, some rode under dragon-headed banners, bearing the names of forefathers who once rode the waves. They did not call themselves Vikings, but they were forged by Viking descendants, raised on hearthside tales, and well aware of the sea's price. Up north, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden grew into kingdoms with strong governments, codified laws, kings, and churches. Yet they preserved the legends of the seafarers. In 12th and 13th century chronicles, the Heimskringla and the Saga of the Kings, they wrote not to rekindle war, but to tell descendants, we once were travelers to the world's edge. In some places, people still carve runes, not for lack of Latin letters, but to remember how their ancestors wrote. On great stones in Uppland, Gotland, and Skåne, one finds memorial stones raised by descendants, inscribing the names of fathers and sons who sailed away and never returned. No tears, only a stark carving. Bjorn, son of Ulfr, journeyed west. He did not return, but he traveled farther than all. In medieval Norse folklore, the Vikings do not vanish. They no longer bear those names. They become sea ghosts, river-guarding giants, underground warriors, sleepless spirits, ever ready to return when land and sky call. To country folk in Norway, Iceland, even the Orkney Islands, there is a belief. If one night the sea roars louder than usual, and the mist thickens more than is normal, that is the old warriors rowing home. They have not forgotten us, and we must not forget them. Descendants of the Vikings, though they no longer wield axes, still hold fast to certain truths. As enduring as cold stone, as practical as the winter wind, and still unwilling to stay in one place too long. How they expanded, adapted, transformed from warriors into merchants, from pirates into counts, from heathens into church patrons. This proves the Viking legacy lies not in axes, but in spirit. That spirit does not roar like waves. It smolders beneath ashes needing but the right breath to blaze again. And sometimes, in an ancient abbey in southern England, one finds a curious carving on a column, a dragon's head entwined with runes. No one knows who carved it, but the old caretaker softly says, perhaps it's their way of reminding us that they were here once, and they still are. There are footprints not erased by rain, not because they pressed deeper into the earth, but because they were carved into memory. When the light of the Viking Age receded from the political map, when no kingdom flew the dragon banner, when longships remained only in museums, one might think the Vikings had completely withdrawn. But in fact, they remained in the only place where every civilization survives, in memory. In Iceland, once the final stop before stepping into Vinland, time flows more slowly than elsewhere. The people there, amid cold winds and volcanoes, still preserve the sagas, still read the Edda, and still believe that their ancestors' blood has never grown cold. In every family, at least one person bears a Norse name: Thorstein, Leif, Einar, Freya, Aslaug. Not merely a name, but a reminder that we do not begin in the present. Icelanders still speak Old Norse, closest to the tongue the Vikings once used. They understand runes without translation. They read epics as bedtime stories. They regard Njal's Saga not as fiction, but as part of their family history. And if you arrive in a small village on a snow-covered night, you may hear an elder recount the legend of the one who sailed to Vinland, of Odin riding his eight-legged horse in dreams, and of children who will journey forth again when the sea calls. Up north, in the Arctic, one still finds the remains of Viking settlement camps along Greenland's coast, where only ice, wind, and the lonely cry of seabirds endure. Ruined stone houses, blackened soil, scattered sheep bones, all lie as if the last departure occurred only a winter ago. No one knows precisely why they vanished from Greenland. Perhaps the climate grew colder, winters longer. Perhaps famine. Perhaps they lost contact with the outside world. Or simply, they chose to withdraw. No inscriptions, no tombstones, only silence stretching across centuries. And in that silence, one hears more than any written history could ever convey. Today, in museums from Oslo to Copenhagen, from Reykjavik to York, Viking ships are reconstructed. Gokstad, Oseberg, Skuldelev. Long oak vessels with soaring dragon prows, slender yet as sturdy as stone, lie serenely under golden lights like veterans resting in eternal slumber. Visitors pass by. Children touch the wooden planks. Guides recount tales of daring voyages, but sometimes someone says nothing. They stand quietly, eyes on the hull, thinking of the sea. Not the sea on a map, but the sea within. The sea of departure. The sea of commitment. The sea of yearning to reach places no one has gone before. The Vikings left behind not only swords, standards, and place names. They left behind ideas. A simple, yet undying belief. There is no farthest place, only places not yet reached. Today, in the minds of adventurers, of voyagers, of children who love to trace maps, and of anyone who has stood before the ocean and felt their heart quicken, there lives a small piece of the Viking spirit. They need not name it. They only need to know they must press on, even if no one has gone before. And on an autumn afternoon in the north, when the sun sinks low as though touching the mountains, you may encounter an old man in a wool cap, holding a wooden mallet, repairing a small boat. When asked, "What are you building?" "That boat is too small to sail." He just smiles. "I'm not building it for the sea. I'm building it for memory. So my grandchild knows that his grandfather once dreamed of the waves." And in that smile lies the millennia of a people who never forgot the sea. Chapter 5. When the Horn-Helmed warrior steps onto the screen, not every story ends when its age does. Some continue, not through events, but through imagination. When the last Viking shipbuilder rested, when the old songs only echoed in Icelandic libraries, that was precisely the moment, among the clamoring noise of the modern world, when the Vikings were reborn. But this time, they emerged not from villages, but from screens, from pages, from keyboards and electronic light. Not everyone knows their true history, but almost everyone has seen their image. In modern imagination, Vikings wear horned helmets, grow long beards, ride dragon ships, shout in battle, and drink mead from animal horns. That image appears on beer steins, tattoos, video games, TV series, and even festival costumes. But the curious fact is, real Vikings never wore horned helmets. No archaeological evidence shows they donned horned headgear in battle. The idea arose in the 19th century when opera stage designers, especially for Richard Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen, sought a wild yet heroic look. Thus, the horned helmet was born, not in the North, but in the German theater. Yet that image endures because it speaks to something deeper: rebellion, strength, defiance of rules. In literature, from the late 19th century to today, Vikings have been idealized. They are no longer merely pirates in the eyes of Anglo-Saxon historians, but explorers, honorable warriors, individuals defying fate. In Franz G. Bengtsson's The Long Ships, 1941, Vikings appear as humorous, brave figures with psychological depth. They travel from the north to Spain, from Constantinople to deserts, confronting religion, politics, and themselves. Since then, the Viking figure has entered popular culture as a timeless symbol of adventure. In film, Vikings have been reinvented many times, from 1950s Hollywood pictures with Kirk Douglas to modern series like Vikings, 2013 to 2020, and The Last Kingdom. Characters such as Ragnar Lothbrok, Lagertha, and Bjorn Ironside are not just warriors, but conflicted souls torn between old faiths and new worlds, between instinct and reason, between glory and peace. They were created not to win battles, but to let modern viewers project contemporary anxieties onto the ancient past. And in that way, Vikings feel familiar, because they too seek meaning in a chaotic world. In video games, Vikings become action icons. Titles like Assassin's Creed, Valhalla, God of War, Northgard, and Valheim immerse players in misty, snowbound, mythic worlds. There they can build villages, fight, explore, or simply watch the aurora after a day's hunt. Not every game is historically accurate, but all capture the spirit. Players needn't know every king or dynasty, only that they are journeying, fighting, surviving in a world still raw and undefined. And so the Viking legacy lives on in experience points, in expanding maps, and in personalized weapon arsenals. In visual art, Viking tattoos become a trend. Not everyone believes in Odin, but many believe in the runes inked on their chest: courage, freedom, fearless of death. And when a modern person stands before the mirror, gazing at a small Mjolnir on their arm, they do not shout these words, but they carry them as a piece of their identity, where courage still lives. Perhaps the strangest thing is, modern Vikings are no longer Scandinavian. They may come from anywhere: America, Japan, Brazil, Vietnam. If someone looks to the sea and feels their heart stir, then a part of them has touched the Viking spirit. No one needs to build a ship now. No one needs to fight. Only to keep asking, if I go on, what will I find? And in that moment, however fleeting, the old sail fills with wind again. Not every legacy is carried harmlessly. There are symbols, though born of warriors, of legends, of pages recounting ancient dreams. When entering the modern world, they bear a weight their very ancestors never foresaw. The Vikings, once fishermen, sailors, storytellers, now pinned to shirts, carved into skin, flown on flags, and sometimes twisted into something they never were. In Europe, the Viking image has long been tied to Nordic national pride. At traditional festivals in Norway, Sweden, and Iceland, people still dress as Viking warriors, reenacting boat building, wood chopping, iron forging, and epic storytelling. There, Vikings are seen as ancestors, as memory, as a belief in strength from the motherland. At the Uphelly AA Festival in Lerwick, Scotland, hundreds carry torches, transform into Viking armies, and burn a longship in the snowy night, not to reenact war, but to connect with the ancestral flame lit thousands of years ago. In Icelandic schools, students read sagas, write runes, and learn to survive in harsh environments like their forebears as an inseparable part of national identity. But once freed from history books, symbols can be wielded in many directions. In the 20th century, Viking imagery was exploited by extremist movements, especially Nazi Germany and white supremacist groups. They appropriated the dragon head, the runic symbols, tattoos of Thornot to honor Viking culture, but to fabricate a false narrative of a superior Nordic race. This misuse continues into the 21st century, when some far-right groups in the US and Europe use Viking symbols as hidden identifiers. Mjolnir becomes an emblem. The Odal and Tiwaz runes morph into hate symbols. However, many cultural organizations and scholars have responded swiftly. They declare Vikings were not a pure race. They were nomads, explorers, embrace of difference people. They married foreigners, learned foreign tongues, and raised children in lands not yet on any map. Museums, historians, and Nordic academic communities refuse to let Viking symbols be stolen. They launch educational campaigns, host conferences, and curate exhibitions to restore the true meaning of old axes, of longships, and of Odin's self-sacrifice upon the world tree. Beyond politics, Viking imagery also appears in modern religion. Some neo-pagan groups, like Asatru, revive ancient Norse faith, worshipping Odin, Thor, and Freya. They hold rituals outdoors, recite old poems, and live by codes of honor, no killing, no extremism. Their religion does not seek to replace modern faiths, but to reconnect deeply with nature, with ancestors, with slower time. Yet, extremist factions also misuse Asatru to spread racist theories, forcing genuine pagan communities to publicly separate and denounce them. Amid these layered meanings, modern Viking symbols become a mirror to our world. Whoever gazes upon them in admiration sees a spirit of exploration, a yearning to transcend limits, courage before the sea. Whoever gazes upon them in prejudice sees only violence, isolation, and a distorted past. Vikings do not literally return, but their story is rewritten every day by everyone who chooses to wear that symbol. And perhaps the fairest thing history can do is to remind us simply, our ancestors once wore iron helmets, but also cloth caps. They sailed with axes, but also plowed fields with their hands. They fought battles, but also sang lullabies. They were not legends. They were people, like us. Not every legacy is carried harmlessly. There are symbols, even if born from warriors, from legend, from pages recounting ancient dreams that, upon entering the modern world, bear a weight their very ancestors never foresaw. The Vikings, once fishermen, seafarers, storytellers, now pinned to shirts, carved into skin, flown on flags, and sometimes twisted into something they never were. In Europe, the Viking image has long been tied to Nordic national pride. At traditional festivals in Norway, Sweden, and Iceland, people still dress as Viking warriors, reenacting boat building, wood chopping, iron forging, and epic storytelling. There, Vikings are seen as ancestors, as memory, as faith in the strength drawn from the motherland. At the Uphellier Festival in Lerwick, Scotland, hundreds carry torches, transform into a Viking army, and burn a longship in the snowy night not to reenact war, but to connect with the ancestral flame lit thousands of years ago. In Icelandic schools, students read sagas, write runes, and learn to survive harsh environments like their forebears as an inseparable part of national identity. But once freed from the pages of history, symbols can be wielded in many directions. In the 20th century, the Viking image was exploited by extremist movements, especially by Nazi Germany and white supremacist groups. They appropriated dragon heads, runic symbols, tattoos of Thor knot to honor Viking culture, but to paint a false narrative of a superior Nordic race. This misuse continued into the 21st century, when some far-right groups in the US and Europe used Viking symbols as covert identifiers. The Mjolnir hammer became an emblem. The Odal and Tiwaz runes were distorted into hate symbols. However, many cultural organizations and scholars responded swiftly. They speak out. Vikings were not a pure race. They were nomadic people, explorers, embracers of difference. They married foreigners, learned other tongues, and raised children in lands not yet on any map. Museums, historians, and Nordic academic communities refuse to let Viking symbols be stolen. They organize educational campaigns, conferences, and exhibitions to restore true meaning to old axes, longships, and the tale of Odin hanging from the world tree. Beyond politics, Viking imagery also appears in modern religion. Neo-pagan groups, such as Asatru, reconstruct ancient Norse faith, worshipping gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. They hold rituals outdoors, recite ancient poems, and live by a code of honor: no killing, no extremism. Their religion does not seek to replace modern faiths, but to connect more deeply with nature, with ancestors, with a slower rhythm of time. Yet some extremist factions misuse Asatru to spread racist ideology, forcing genuine pagan communities to publicly disavow and clarify their beliefs. Amid these many layers, Viking symbols today become a mirror for our world. Whoever looks at them with admiration sees a spirit of exploration, a yearning to transcend limits, courage before the sea. Whoever looks with prejudice sees only violence, isolation, and a distorted past. Vikings do not literally return, but their story is rewritten every day by everyone who chooses to embrace that symbol. And perhaps the fairest thing history can do is to remind us of one simple truth. Our ancestors once wore iron helmets, but also cloth caps. They sailed with axes, but also plowed fields by hand. They fought battles, but also sang lullabies. They were not legends. They were people, like us. Chapter 6. Blood and Roots. The formation of the first clans of the North. For thousands of years, before the dragon-prowed ships cleaved the waves of the North Sea, the northern lands were not yet called Viking. It was a silent world, dotted with ancient pine forests, quiet lake shores, and endless stretches of cold earth. That world had no borders, no kingdoms, and no one thought themselves part of anything larger than the small village where they were born. But from that very stillness, a structure began to grow, not founded by any king, but woven together by blood, soil, and time. The formation of clans, the first units of belief, power, identity, and survival in ancient North European society. In the periods known to history as the Late Stone Age and the Bronze Age of Northern Europe, from roughly 2500 to 800 BC, small communities began gathering near rivers, lakes, and coastlines. No one called it an organization, yet they soon realized that living close together helped them endure harsh winters. They shared fire, shared meat, shared shelter, and together built the first longhouses, crude in shape, but enough to block the wind and hold warmth for a multi-generation family. Within these communities, leaders were not elected by ballot, but recognized by natural consensus. The strongest, the most experienced, the one daring enough to venture into the deepest snow, or the one who knew how to summon the fish into the bay at the height of famine. These were obeyed. When such a leader died, their authority did not vanish. It remained in their name, in their story, and gradually passed to their descendants. People of the same bloodline came to understand that kinship was not merely a biological bond, but also a symbol of safety, responsibility, and pride. The clan, as an abstract living entity, began to take shape, existing alongside the individual and growing stronger through the years. Each clan chose its own symbol, sometimes an animal, a mountain, a sacred stone, or even just a simple dot carved on a wooden staff. These symbols were never advertised. There was no heraldic banner. Instead, they were etched onto tools, carved on doorways, drawn in charcoal on cave walls, and whispered in every lullaby. Inside a clan, everything was organized by role, not by rigid gender, but by ability. Those skilled in hunting led the hunts. Those skilled in storytelling kept the hearth fire alive and preserved memory. Those who could carve stone passed on the earliest runes. Symbols, not for literary writing, but to record totems, curses, or the marking of the first winter's turning. For many generations, clans lived largely isolated, with minimal contact. But when the climate shifted, populations grew, and fertile land became scarce. Clans were forced to meet first to trade, then to dispute, and finally to figure out how to coexist. From this necessity, the first alliances formed not official treaties, but bonds forged through marriage, oaths, or sacred rituals under the moonlight. Belief played a pivotal role in maintaining the clan. Northerners believed each clan had its own guardian spirit, called a fylgja, that often appeared in the form of an animal. If someone dreamed of their fylgja abandoning them, it was a dire omen that the clan was weakening. They worshipped unnamed deities, the god of wind, the god of fire, the god of thunder. They erected large stones in the center of their village called Hur-Gur as sites for rituals marking birth, death, or the onset of winter. Within each clan, the elders were regarded as the roots of a tree anchoring the soil, preserving the clan's lore, and guarding the path home. They were not cast aside. They sat in the heart of the longhouse, telling stories, observing, and issuing warnings. The youth were the branches strong, daring, reaching outward. Over time, they would be the ones to leave the village and found new clans, yet always remembering their roots. When a clan grew powerful, it expanded not merely by land, but by influence. Stronger clans began hosting winter gatherings, where smaller clans came to offer tribute, seek alliances, or resolve disputes. These meetings later became the precursor to the Thing, the autonomous assembly of the Northmen. In a Thing, no one had a throne, but the one who spoke best, kept their word, and earned respect held authority. Remarkably, despite living in a harsh environment, the social structure of pre-Viking northern clans was not based solely on force. Honor, oaths, and belief were paramount. If one broke a promise to another clan, the penalty was more than loss of face. It could mean the withdrawal of the clan's protective spirit. Faith was law, and law was living belief. When night fell, children in the clan were not told stories merely to fall asleep, but to remember. Each tale of an ancestor battling a bear, of a grandmother dreaming her clan's Fylgja plunged into the sea, of a brother who died for breaking an oath, carried a fairy tale shell and a survival lesson core. It was from these fragmented strands of clan memory that the Vikings were born, not as a separate race, but as the result of hundreds of clans learning to live with wind, with ice, and with the contradictions between humankind and nature. When the Viking Age dawned, when ships set sail, when sails filled with wind carrying axes, shields, and faith, those voyagers did not go alone. They carried their clan names, their symbols, their oaths, and the shadow of their Fylgja. They did not sail to grow rich, but to prove their clan's strength. And when they fell on foreign soil, their names were carved in stone, not so that the individual might live forever, but so the clan would not be forgotten. Thus, to understand the pre-Viking clans is to understand the foundation of everything that followed: warriors, mythology, society, and law. Without clans, there were no Vikings. Without Fylgja, there were no dreams to guide them across the sea. Without the ancestors' memory, no one would have taken that first step beyond the village. In that silence spanning centuries, the northern clans could not wait for written record. They left themselves behind in legend, in stone, in hearth fires, and in the eyes turned toward the deep forest. There, the first child of the next clan would pick up an axe, and the story would begin again. Just as tree roots grow deep underground unseen, yet remain the only thing keeping the tree alive, the pre-Viking clans of the North quietly built the sturdy framework upon which the culture and society that would later blossom were founded. They were entities both concrete and abstract, where a name was not merely a label, but a map of bloodlines, a personal history, a responsibility to ancestors and descendants alike. Each clan had its own legend, and that legend was told not only to honor the departed, but to guide the living. No one was born unconnected to a clan, and no one died without leaving an impact, whether glorious or shameful, on their clan. In that early clan structure, the elders held the central position. There were no written books, no texts, but the elders were living repositories of law, of names, of tragedies, and lessons. They did not need to remember everything, for memory did not have to be perfect. It only had to capture the spirit, and that spirit was passed on by slow storytelling, by simple song, by eyes that looked not at the fire itself, but through it. At village gatherings, the elders did not issue commands. They spoke, then fell silent. And in that silence, the young knew what must be done. No laws were written down, but everyone knew what was forbidden: to break an oath, to insult the ancestors, to forget one's teachers, and most grievously, to dishonor one's clan before other clans. Honor was not an abstract concept, but something bound to one's food, shelter, and even one's life. A clan that lost its honor could be shunned in food exchanges, barred from winter ceremonies, refused marriage alliances, and worst of all, its name would not be sung in the storytelling songs. To have one's name forgotten in ancient northern culture was punishment equal to death. Within each clan, the role of women was far from marginal, as in many contemporaneous societies. They did more than domestic chores. They tended the hearth fire, sowed the seeds, guarded the honey, the salt, and the life itself. They were the first to teach runes to the children, the first to recite the legends before the child could distinguish dream from reality. Women also safeguarded sacred objects, amulets of bone, shells, inscribed stones, passed down through generations. In some clans, women even held the right to choose the new leader when the chieftain died. And in special cases, the eldest woman known by the title Volva served as the clan's seer, connecting with ancestors and conveying the gods' words. These women were not witches, but individuals who knew how to listen to the world's subtle movements through dreams, the sound of wind, the taste of grass, or simply intuition. Pre-Viking clan society had no state, no courts, no criminal code as in later times. But it had something more important: bonds of trust. People trusted one another because they drank from the same well, hunted in the same forest, and buried their ancestors beneath the same stone. If conflict arose between two clans, it did not necessarily lead to war. It was often resolved through exchange, restitution, or marriage ties. In serious cases, a neutral council would be formed, composed of representatives from unrelated clans to adjudicate. Every statement in that council had to be sworn upon, and if an oath was broken, it shamed not only the speaker, but invited calamity upon the entire clan. There were rituals whose full meaning remains obscure today. For example, a youth had to sleep in the forest for 3 consecutive nights to meet his true Fylgja. Or one who was near death would be laid on a stone in the snow to hear the ancestors guiding him. Such rites have no rational explanation in modern science, but in clan culture, they were indispensable milestones. One who did not complete these rites would not be considered fully adult, and upon death might not be welcomed by the ancestors. These details reveal something unique. Ancient Northerners lived deeply connected to the spirit world, not as some distant supernatural realm, but as an integral part of life. The Fylgja, the sole image of the clan, could appear as a fox, a bird, a serpent, a fish, or sometimes as a faint human form. It was not worshipped, but honored. No one called its name aloud, only whispered it when truly needed. And when a string of misfortunes broke out, people did not blame one another. They worked together to reconcile with the Fylgja. Many clans share similar stories of an ancestor guiding the entire village through famine by eating stones and roots, of a blind man still able to shoot a deer, or of a 16-year-old girl who journeyed deep into the forest to gather herbs and save her mother. Those stories, though perhaps inaccurate in detail, are perfectly accurate in their values: courage, loyalty, endurance, and gratitude. No one was forced to believe them, yet everyone listened. And from that listening, a culture was born, requiring no castles, no crowns, no crosses. The clans, after hundreds of winters, learned how to hold one another together. They knew that sometimes they had to part when a small group broke away to found a new village, but they always carried with them a founding stone, a bowl of old earth, or a strand of the elder's hair to never lose their roots. And when they grew into communities with ships, with axes, with myths, the one thing that prevented them from dissolving into chaos was that which had existed from the start: the clan. Therefore, when you see a Viking warrior sharpening his axe by the hearth, do not see only a man preparing for battle. See the entire clan behind him, those who taught him how to keep the fire, how to tell stories, how to speak truth when no one wanted to hear it, and most importantly, how to leave but never forget the way home. In every Viking sail straining out to sea, there is wind, there are rowers, there is food, there are axes, but there are also things no one sees: ancestor names carved into the heart, the image of the Fylgja in one's dreams, and the oath to one's clan that no matter how far they roam, their honor will never be lost. And that precisely is what transformed the Vikings from a band of warriors into a civilization remembered forever. Just as tree roots grow deep underground, unseen, yet remain the only thing keeping the tree alive, the pre-Viking clans of the North also quietly built the solid framework on which the entire culture and society would later flourish. They were entities both concrete and abstract, where a name was not merely a label, but also a map of kinship, a personal history, and a responsibility to ancestors and descendants alike. Each clan had its own legend, and that legend was not told simply to honor the dead, but to guide the living. No one was born without belonging to a clan, and no one died without leaving a mark on it, whether by glory or disgrace. In that early clan structure, the elders held the central place. There were no written records or texts, yet the elders were living repositories of law, of names, of tragedies and lessons. They did not need to remember everything perfectly. Memory needed only to capture the spirit, and that spirit was passed on through slow storytelling, simple songs, and eyes that looked not at the hearth fire itself, but through its glow. At village gatherings, the elders did not issue commands. They spoke, then fell silent. And in that silence, the youth understood what must be done. No laws were written down, but everyone knew the forbidden: to break an oath, insult the ancestors, forget one's mentors, and worst of all, bring dishonor upon one's clan before other clans. Honor was not abstract. It was bound up in one's food, shelter, and even life itself. A clan that lost its honor might be shunned at food exchanges, barred from winter rituals, denied marriage alliances, and most grievously, its name would be omitted from the saga songs. In ancient northern culture, to have one's name forgotten was a punishment equal to death. Within every clan, the role of women was far from marginal. They did more than household tasks. They kept the hearth fire, sowed seeds, guarded the honey and salt, the very essence of life. They were the first to teach runes to children and to recite the clan's legends before the child could distinguish dream from reality. Women also safeguarded sacred objects, amulets of bone, shells, and inscribed stones handed down through generations. In some clans, women even had the right to choose a new leader when the chieftain died. And in certain exceptional cases, the eldest woman, called a vulva, served as the clan's prophetess, connecting with ancestors and conveying the gods' messages. These women were not witches, but those who knew how to listen to the world's subtle currents through dreams, the sound of wind, the taste of grass, or simple intuition. Pre-Viking clan society had no state, no courts, and no criminal code as in later times. But it had something more important: bonds of trust. People trusted one another because they drank from the same well, hunted in the same forest, and buried their ancestors beneath the same stone. When conflict arose between two clans, it did not necessarily lead to war. It was often resolved through exchange, compensation, or marriage ties. In serious disputes, a neutral council composed of representatives from unrelated clans would be convened. Every statement before that council had to be sworn upon, and if an oath was broken, it not only shamed the speaker, but brought misfortune upon the entire clan. There were rituals whose full meaning remains obscure today. For example, a youth might spend 3 nights alone in the forest to meet his true Fylgja, or a person near death would be placed on a stone in the snow to hear the ancestors' guidance. Such rites defy modern scientific explanation, but in clan culture, they were indispensable milestones. One who had not undergone them would not be considered fully adult, and upon death might not be welcomed by the ancestors. These details reveal something extraordinary. Ancient Northerners lived in intimate connection with the spirit world, not as some distant supernatural realm, but as an evident part of life. The Fylgja, the clan's guardian spirit, might appear as a fox, a bird, a serpent, a fish, or sometimes a faint human figure. It was not worshipped, but honored. Its name was not shouted aloud, only whispered when needed. And when a string of misfortune struck, people did not blame one another. They sought together to reconcile with their Fylgja. Many clans share similar stories of an ancestor who led the entire village through famine by eating stones and roots, of a blind man still able to strike a deer, of a 16-year-old girl who braved a dark forest to gather healing herbs and save her mother. These stories, though perhaps imprecise in detail, are perfectly precise in values: courage, loyalty, endurance, and gratitude. No one was forced to believe them, yet everyone listened. And from that listening arose a culture needing no castles, crowns, or crosses. After hundreds of winters, the clans learned how to hold one another together. They knew that sometimes separation was necessary when a small group left to found a new settlement. But they always carried with them a founding stone, a bowl of ancestral soil, or a strand of the elder's hair so as never to lose their roots. And when those settlements grew into communities with ships, with axes, with myths, it was that original clan bond that kept them from dissolving into chaos. Therefore, when you see a Viking warrior sharpening his axe by the hearth, do not see only a man preparing for battle. See the entire clan behind him, those who taught him to keep the fire, to tell the stories, to speak truth when no one else would, and most crucially, to leave but never forget the way home. In every Viking sail filling with wind, there are rowers, provisions, and weapons, but also unseen things, ancestors' names carved into the heart, the image of the Fylgja in dreams, and the oath to one's clan that no matter how far they roam, their honor will not be lost. And that was precisely what transformed the Vikings from a band of warriors into a civilization remembered forever. Chapter 7. When Forests Became Banners. The First Alliances of the North. Each clan is a seed, and at a certain moment, when its roots have grown deep enough, its branches stretched wide, and winter is no longer a solitary enemy. Those seeds realize they cannot survive alone. For centuries, the northern clans lived as closed microcosms. They hunted separately, worshipped separately, and told their own legends to their descendants. But when people began venturing beyond familiar woods, following long rivers, crossing rolling hills, and meeting others like themselves, but speaking different tongues, they asked a question never asked before. Who are we? When we are no longer only ourselves. Archaeologists and historians agree that from the 6th to the 8th century AD, slight climate shifts, population growth, and early trade pushed these clans into a new world where allies and enemies were no longer clear, and survival could not rely on blood ties alone. At ancient winter assemblies, called Thing Clan, representatives began to gather, not merely to speak, but to negotiate, forge bonds, and swear oaths before the gods. A mountain clan might trade furs for iron. A coastal clan might need pine from the west. At first, these exchanges were purely material, but gradually, from that dependence, social bonds formed. When harvests failed or a clan came under pressure from migrating southern bands, they sought refuge or aid from neighboring clans. If that plea was answered, an alliance was born, an alliance sworn in life and death. This alliance was unlike any modern state, no constitution, no banner. Yet it stood firm like granite bound by vows at sacred stones, sealed by marriages among children, and maintained by shared presence in communal rites. From small packs of 2 or 3 clans, larger communities emerged. They began to divide territories for shared hunts, set conventions for dividing newly discovered resources, and most crucially, unify their legends. No longer did each elder tell separate tales. Odin of one village met Thor of another. Freya was worshipped across the region, and the story of Yggdrasil appeared as a common axis for all faiths. Mythology became a shared language, In central regions like Vestfold, Norway, Skåne, Sweden, and Jutland, Denmark, great alliances formed not of single clans, but of many clans under leaders chosen not by birth, but by prestige, deeds, and trust. These leaders were called konungar, the forerunners of the later kings, but initially held no absolute power. They served as mediators, judges, ceremonial heads, and spokespeople for the clans when dealing with outsiders. No thrones, no marble halls, only a banner of wolf fur hung from an ancient oak marking the sacred stone's place. Beneath that banner, diverse clans convened, not to be ruled, but to coexist. From this point, social stratification sharpened, not merely young and old, but warriors, ritual specialists, farmers, and freemen. In alliances, some specialized in forging weapons, some in tilling fields, some in conducting rites. Yet every voice mattered, especially in the Thing, where every clan had its representative. But as alliances grew powerful, unaligned clans became vulnerable. A new practice emerged: absorption. A weaker clan would petition to join a stronger one, relinquishing its name in exchange for protection, participation in feasts, and most importantly, a place in the new clan's ancestry. Through this, many legends blended, forging a more unified Norse pantheon led by Odin, warrior Thor, fertility god Freyr, and keeper of the dead Hel. Not every alliance was peaceful. Some clans refused to merge, choosing to preserve their own faiths and ways, even rejecting the Thing. Those clans gradually vanished from memory, not because they were weak, but because they lay outside the collective web of remembrance. Meanwhile, merged clans began producing a warrior caste youths trained from childhood in axe-wielding, ship-sailing, saga reciting, and swordless negotiation. These were the precursors of the first Viking warriors. They were not merely fighters, they embodied the distillation of many clans, countless memories, and ancient oaths. When an alliance was large enough, when its warriors were numerous, when its ceremonies echoed beyond its own borders, the name Viking began to appear. Not as an ethnicity, but as a social role. Those who ventured forth for honor, for clan, for expansion, but never for flight. From then on, the axe was more than a tool. It was a symbol. The ship was more than transport. It was a pledge to return. And every warrior setting sail carried with him the entire network of clans, their legends and alliances bound by time rather than written treaties. This chapter closes with an image. One cold dawn, beside a mist-shrouded fjord. When the air hangs still, an alliance of clans gathers around the very first dragon ship. No cheers ring out. No drums sound. Only the crackle of fire, the whisper of wind, and eyes fixed on the sail as it slowly billows. On the hull, no single name is carved, only the name of the clan. And just beneath, in ancient runes, a single line. When the wind blows, remember where your roots take hold. The sea, in the world of the Northmen, was never a boundary. It was an invitation. The cold face that the ancestors still gazed upon each dawn. A place where the wind carries the unknown, just like a child's earliest dreams, before growing up. Before they became pirates, in others' eyes, the Vikings were sailors in their own. And before the dragon ships ever cleaved distant waves, there were small boats carved from birch trunks bound with hemp twine, braving north winds to carry fish, salt, and stories from one village to the next. No one knows where the very first voyage began, but over centuries, people set out at first for only a few miles along the shore, then farther to islands like Gotland and Bornholm, or even across to the Frisian coast. With each departure went a clan's trust. Boats were never hewn from nameless trees. They were shaped from the largest timber in the ancestral grove, bore the clan's symbol carved under the hull, and carried an oath that if they did not return, at least the name would live on. Those earliest warriors did not call themselves Vikings. They were clan envoys, chosen for their quickness, sea sense, and ability to read sky and wind. When they left familiar waters and glimpsed lights on a strange shore, they did not call it a new world, but a world waiting to be told. In regions such as England, France, and northern Germany, coastal villages began spotting unfamiliar boats, not large or blaring, but with rectangular sails, long, narrow hulls, slicing the water like a bird's shadow. Those stepping ashore did not always bear weapons. They carried amber, furs, dried salt fish, and things unsellable, like their stories and curious gazes. At first, they traded exchanging goods for iron, glass, wine. Then they learned how to read others' maps, how to observe fortifications, how to judge a harbor, how foreigners reacted when they smiled, fell silent, or drew an axe, not to threaten, but to carve firewood. No two voyages were the same. Some never returned. Some came back with tales. Gradually, clans began designating a group of warriors not only for defense, but to sail each season. They were trained, provisioned from special rations, taught to live cramped aboard, to hide daggers under their tunics, and most critically, when to remain silent. When those warriors returned, they were not greeted with feasts, but with quiet. Elders watched from afar. Women laid hands on an axe whose haft was worn. Children studied a mud-spattered fur cloak. Then, if the warriors spoke, they spoke not to boast of deeds, but so the entire clan would know. A world was opening just beyond the horizon. In great alliances at places like Uppsala or Hedeby, clan leaders organized flotillas. Each clan contributed a boat, a handful of warriors, some food, and a symbol. These boats were bound together by an oath sworn at the sacred stone that they would not betray one another, no matter what lay in distant lands. From this, the term Viking began to be spoken as a rotating duty, each clan's time to send sailors forth, not to pillage, but to make their presence known. Some groups visited coastal monasteries in England. They beheld wealth unguarded. They returned with communion wine, manuscripts in unreadable scripts, and golden icons. These treasures were not kept privately, but distributed throughout the alliance as a collective affirmation. Our clan's feet have trod where none came before. Thus began a curious era, where honor derived not only from defending the village, but from leaving it. Clans no longer competed merely for land, but for who could journey the farthest, who reached Dublin, who returned from Lindisfarne, who survived a clash on the Loire. A Viking warrior was no longer a reckless youth. He was an unofficial envoy of an entire network of faith, language, and clan organization, and every act of his, whether negotiation, trade, or combat, bore an unspoken charge: do not let others think our clan is weak. Not every expedition succeeded. Some never returned. Some were enslaved. Yet failure taught clans caution, better preparation, and deeper solidarity. They erected sturdy harbors, built grain stores, and posted guardians at sacred stones whenever warriors set sail. Houses were etched with runes, so that ancestors know we did not wander aimlessly, but went onward. From sea and wind, from blood and ember, the earliest Vikings drew maps not with ink, but with memory, with legend, and with others' tales of them. In the great trading centers of Dorestad, York, or Rouen, when a stranger displays a wolf-carved axe or a peculiar rune-inscribed arm ring, no one asks, "Who are you?" They ask, "Which clan do you come from?" And the answer is more than a name. It is proof that the clan lives on, sails on, and will be remembered. The Vikings, from the very beginning, did not set out to conquer. They set out because their clan needed someone to venture farther. They set out because the sea had no borders, because the clouds still drifted toward the horizon, and because their ancestors never said, "Stop here." As voyages grew more frequent, as dragon-proud ships returned not just with loot, but with ideas of another life, the northern clans faced a new question. Can we live elsewhere, yet carry our old ways with us? In lands like England, Ireland, France, and even Western Russia, the Vikings left more than embers and footprints on the shore. They began to build homes, but not by tearing down local villages, but by weaving themselves in them. Among native huts stood a longhouse in the Scandinavian style. Beside a stone church grew a market where amber, furs, and Scandinavian wares appeared. Some settled because they could not return due to war, shipwreck, or because they had fallen in love with a new place. Others were sent to stay behind, representing their clan, holding land, and acting as the living link between homeland and new soil. They did not go alone. They brought wives, carpenters, priests, and even a small clan stone from home, buried beneath the new hearth as a way to say, "We have not abandoned our roots." In northern England, the town of York, once a native stronghold, then a Roman outpost, later abandoned, was transformed by Vikings in the 9th century into Jorvik, not merely a fortress, but a true city with smiths, open markets, churches, and rune schools. In Normandy, France, the Viking leader, Rollo, rather than pillage negotiated terms, washed his hands in the Seine and swore fealty in exchange for land. He did not vanish into French culture. He quietly sowed Norse seeds in French soil. Centuries later, his descendant William would become William the Conqueror of England. And in his veins flowed Viking blood, by then thoroughly blended with Europe's. In Dublin, Ireland, Vikings created a bustling trade center ports, fish markets, forges, and shipyards. They did not destroy the native community, but lived alongside it. The Irish learned Viking shipbuilding. The Vikings learned the local tongue, and hybrid children bearing double names, half Norse, half Celt, began to be born. No longer strangers. No longer just those who left. They became those who stayed. Back home, clans were initially skeptical. But when word returned, along with exotic goods, reports of fertile lands, and tales from survivors, they began to see settlement not as betrayal, but as expansion. A clan could exist in many places, as long as they worshipped a shared ancestor, bore a common symbol, and told the same winter tales. From this, Viking clans spread branches, founding new offshoots on foreign soil. They named towns after home, preserved identical rights, and each year, on a special day, reassembled their sacred stone altar, even if it meant using Frankish bricks or Celtic gravel. This act mattered not for form, but for essence. When they lit the fire, they closed their eyes and heard the forest of their homeland. In Russia, the Norse known as Varangians did not come solely to raid, but to escort trade caravans and build river stations along the Volga and Dnieper. They founded cities like Novgorod and Kiev not by sword, but by connection. They intermarried with Slavs, learned the local script, and laid the groundwork for the Rus state, the ancestor of modern Russia. There, Norse legends were not forgotten, but fused with Slavic myth to form a new current. And at every winter festival, people still invoked ancestors from the frozen West, those who had followed the wind across thousands of miles to prove we do not fear leaving home. The Vikings did sometimes fail in southern Spain, the Arab lands, or Byzantium, where they were driven off, enslaved, or vanished, leaving no trace. Yet even in defeat, their footprints remained. A foreign word in local dialect, a fragment of rune on a doorframe, or a folk song about those from the cold north. And then came the greatest question for a clan. If our children no longer live at home, then who are we? The answer did not come from the chieftain, nor from the elder, nor from the gods. It came from a mother in a small Norman cottage when her child asked, "Mother, do you remember where you were born?" She smiled, placed a hand over her heart, and said, "Home is wherever I am, as long as I still tell the old stories." And so the Vikings no longer lived only in Scandinavia. They lived in York, in Kiev, in Dublin, in Rouen, but wherever they settled, they never lost one truth. A clan is not defined by where you stand, but by how you remember. Chapter 8. When ice becomes a crown, the birth of the Viking kingdoms. From the place where wind lashes the face like an ancestral hand awakening you, from the place where pine forests sing like songs in the bones, from the place where ships are built not to leave, but to return, the Vikings ceased to be mere clans. They began to become kingdoms. The formation of kingdoms was no surprise. It was the inevitable result of centuries of clans merging, alliances protecting one another, and warriors returning bearing more than spoils. They bore ideas of organization. When a clan grew strong enough, its leader recognized by other clans, its territory secured, its warships, armies, priests, and codified laws in place, it had become the nucleus of a kingdom. In Denmark, around the 8th century, the name Gudfred began to be spoken. No one knows his birth year, but all recall that he united the tribes around the Baltic, built the Danevirk defense line against the Franks, and laid the foundation for Denmark's first royal dynasty. He never called himself king, but his enemies called him the man who could command thousands of warriors with a single nod. In Norway, a land more rugged, unification came more slowly. Yet by about 872 AD, one name shone like an unavoidable axe blow: Harold Fairhair. They say he vowed not to cut his hair until all of Norway was united, and he kept his vow. His hair grew wild as forest undergrowth, but his power stood firm as the rock beneath the waves. Harold was not just a warrior, he symbolized the merging of clans into a central authority. Under him, tribes were no longer fully autonomous, but came under oversight, paid tribute, and agreed on common laws. Instead of isolated sacred stones, harvest rites began to be held centrally. Thus, Norway gradually became a true kingdom, not just with a king, but with a collective we rising above individual kinship groups. In Sweden, the tribes around Lake Mälaren also began gathering under a single focal point, Old Uppsala, home to the greatest shrine of Odin, Thor, and Freyr. Here, unity was achieved not by sword, but by faith. Anyone wishing to preserve their honor had to take part in the Uppsala rites. Those who did not were no longer seen as part of the northern people. This soft power held Sweden together, and later rulers like Olaf Skotkonung would be among the first to mark the end of the era of scattered clans. But the most significant change did not lie in who took the throne, but in the fact that, for the first time, the Vikings had written laws. Before, laws lived in the mouths of elders, passed down in speech. As kingdoms emerged, they began inscribing laws in runes, burying them in wooden columns at the heart of villages, or carving them on large stones in the public square. These laws covered not only murder or theft, but inheritance, marriage, ritual duties, and the rights of warriors in battle. This meant that honor ceased to belong solely to one's clan. It became the collective honor of an entire realm. A wrongdoer no longer brought shame only upon their kin, but upon the very land of their birth. At the same time, Norse mythology began to be standardized. Earlier, each clan told its own version. Odin might be a warrior in one, a sorcerer in another, or a wanderer in a third. But now, to preserve unity, kingdom priests started compiling these legends into epic cycles lengthy, detailed, cohesive, and philosophical. People came to see Odin as the king of the gods, ancient, solitary, one-eyed, yet all-seeing. Thor became his son, the embodiment of the warrior's strength and loyalty. Freyja, goddess of love and war, became the symbol of both life and death. More important still was the concept of Ragnarok, the Viking apocalypse. When the gods would perish, clans would fall, the world be consumed by fire, and a new world rise from the ashes. This was not apocalypse for its own sake, but a reminder that nothing is eternal, and that the greatest honor lies not in living forever, but in dying well. When these elements combined, king, law, mythology, the Vikings ceased to be mere maritime warriors. They became a civilization, organized, philosophical, artistic, architectural, historical, and capable of shaping all of Europe. At their harbors, one heard not only the hammer on the hull, but the reading of statutes. At their temples, people did more than worship. They recounted their ancestry. And at their things, where laws were judged, people did more than argue. They wrote history, not with books, but by telling others, I come from the kingdom of those who keep their word. Chapter 9. When the warrior becomes legend, the myths of Bjorn and Ragnar. There are names that, when spoken, need no introduction. Just ask, "Have you heard of Bjorn?" And your listener will sit down, as if that tale has lived in their blood all along. Not because Bjorn was king, not because he never lost a battle, but because Bjorn did not need to win to become immortal. His full name was Bjorn Ironside, Bjorn Ironside. No one knows his birth name for certain. No one is sure how much of his story is fact. But every saga agrees. When a sword pierced his side, it bent as though striking solid stone. Bjorn was the son of a man who also needs no introduction. Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar, the man in dragonskin trousers, who scaled the walls of Paris, who laughed as he was thrown into a pit of venomous snakes, not because he feared nothing, but because he knew his death would outlive his life. Bjorn's legend begins in childhood. He did not cry at thunder. He did not flinch when his mother Lagertha washed her blade in the blood of hunted beasts. When he grew up, he did not learn letters. He learned to read the waves. When others heard church bells, he heard the wind's shifting note. And when others sharpened axes to cut, Bjorn sharpened his axe to journey beyond. He did not seek to rule. He sought to find places no map had named. So, with his brothers, Ivar, Hvitserk, Sigurd, he departed home carrying his clan's mark, a two-headed wolf, and an oath never to retreat. No one counted all the lands Bjorn visited, from the villages of England, where villagers fled at the thrum of their drums, to Paris itself, where he used a ruse of feigned death to breach the tallest ramparts. The French, led by King Charles, felt secure behind their stone walls until Bjorn masqueraded as a corpse, was carried inside for burial, and then, under cover of night, opened the gates from within. Paris was not merely sacked, it was retold, and each retelling made Bjorn more immense, more fleet, less talkative, his gaze as fathomless as the sea. The Vikings did not tell tales to boast. They told them to remember. And although Bjorn later became king of Uppsala, he is remembered not for his throne, but because he never let any foe live without knowing his name. Ragnar, his father, is another saga. Ragnar was a dreamer, and that made him dangerous. He did not fight to conquer. He fought to show that laws could be rewritten. He once wed a shield maiden, Lagertha, after a single battle. He once slew a dragon, or perhaps merely a great serpent. Sagas differ. He once voyaged to England when no one yet knew it, bearing ravens as his emblem. When captured by King Aella, he did not beg. He merely said, "My sons will drench your head in blood." And so, when Ragnar was cast into the snake pit and sang his death dirge, what is remembered is not how he died, but how he laughed as he died. Afterward, his sons, including Bjorn, raised the great heathen army to invade England, not merely to conquer, but to make their father's name the destiny of a land. Vikings needed no proof. They had memory, and that memory is enough to keep a child listening all winter, to learn how Ragnar crossed oceans, how Bjorn returned unscarred. They say Ragnar opened the way. Bjorn kept it alive. No grave was found for them, only stones, broken axes, and runes carved on cliff faces remain. But that was how they chose to be remembered, not in ashes, but in story. Not everyone born with a fragile body must accept weakness. And not only men can be Viking warriors. They called him Ivar the Boneless. No one knows where that name came from. Some say he suffered from soft bones and couldn't walk like other men. Others say it was a metaphor, because Ivar was as supple as a serpent, as mist, as something unbreakable. But one thing is sure. Anyone who laughed at his inability to stand would soon find they themselves could not rise. Ivar did not rely on muscle. He relied on mind. While his brothers, Bjorn, Sigurd, charged forward with axe and shield, Ivar watched in silence. He did not shout. He did not brandish threats. He would lean close to a lone warrior and whisper, "If we strike the camp at dawn's first light, they'll pursue blindly and not know they're defeated." In the campaign, avenging their father Ragnar, it was Ivar who organized and directed the great heathen army. He was not the first into battle. He knew exactly when to step back so his forces could advance threefold. In England, Ivar conquered not by armies, but by sowing discord among his foes. He sought out weak kings, forged alliances, split native clans, and then struck when all suspicion lay within. The Anglo-Saxons did not fear the Viking sword. They feared Ivar's silence. For when he fell still, by dawn, a village would vanish. Vikings were not known for recounting strategy. They preferred blood and axes. Yet, of Ivar, they said, "He needs no legs to lead an army, because the army follows him." No shield bore his name. No temple was raised in his honor. But whenever tales spoke of warriors cold as forged steel, people spoke also of Ivar, boneless, yet chilling all of Europe to its core, and Lagertha, that is an entirely different chapter of Norse legend. Not because she was a woman, but because she refused to be called one before she was called a warrior. Lagertha was not born into a great clan. She is said to have been a simple farmer, but when raiders attacked and her husband was slain, she seized an axe and stood against them, outmatching the men. In the sagas, when Ragnar came courting and found Lagertha single-handedly dispatching 3 marauders, dagger in one hand, the hair of a still-living foe in the other, he did not woo her or offer marriage. He knelt and said, "You alone can stand with me in life and in death." Lagertha married Ragnar. She bore his children. She rode into battle. She did not remain home while her husband fought. She fought by his side. When Ragnar was betrayed, it was Lagertha who raised an army and rode to his rescue, not as his wife, but by right of warrior. Later, when they parted, Lagertha did not fade away. She became chieftain of her own territory, with troops, laws, and even her own temple. Vikings were unaccustomed to female leaders, but none dared deny her authority. For the last soldier to retreat from her battlefield always said, "She still stands." Few tales tell of Lagertha's later years. Some say she died in battle, others that she became a priestess, teaching daughters how to bear axes and keep the hearth fire alive. But all agree, when the sky roars thunder, that is when she rises in fury. And so, in Viking memory, there were warriors who needed no precedent. One could not stand. One did not fit the mold, yet both compelled an entire era to remember their names. There are names that, when spoken, need no introduction. Just say, Have you heard of Bjorn? And the listener will sit down as though that tale has been in their blood for ages. Not because Bjorn was a king, not because he never tasted defeat, but because Bjorn did not need to win to become immortal. His full name was Bjorn Ironside. Bjorn Ironside. No one knows his birth name for certain. No one can say how much of his saga is fact. Yet every saga agrees. When a sword struck his side, the blade bent as though it struck a rock. Bjorn was the son of a man who also needs no introduction. Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar, the man in dragon-hide breeches who once scaled Paris's walls, who laughed as he was thrown into a pit of venomous serpents. Not because he knew no fear, but because he knew his death would outlast his life. Bjorn's story begins in childhood. He did not flinch at thunder, and he did not waver when his mother Lagertha washed her battle axe in the blood of her prey. When he grew older, he did not learn letters. He learned to read the waves. When others heard church bells, he heard the wind's changing note. And when others sharpened axes for battle, Bjorn sharpened his axe to sail farther. He did not yearn to rule. He yearned to find lands no map had named. So, with his brothers, Ivar, Hvitserk, Sigurd, he sailed forth bearing his clan's emblem, a two-headed wolf, and an oath never to retreat. No one counted all the lands Bjorn visited. From England's coastal villages, where farmers fled at the drumbeat of Viking war, to Paris itself, where he used the ruse of feigned death to overcome the tallest ramparts. The French, led by King Charles, felt secure behind their stone walls, until Bjorn disguised himself as a corpse, was carried inside for burial, and then, under cover of night, opened the gates from within. Paris was not merely sacked, it was narrated, and each retelling made Bjorn greater, swifter, quieter, his gaze as fathomless as the sea. The Vikings did not tell tales to boast. They told tales to remember, and though Bjorn later became king in Uppsala, he is remembered not for his throne, but because he left no foe alive who did not know his name. Ragnar, his father, is another legend altogether. Ragnar was a dreamer, and that made him perilous. He did not fight to conquer. He fought to prove that the world's rules could be rewritten. He once wed a shield maiden, Lagertha, after a single skirmish. He once slew a dragon, or perhaps only a great serpent. Sagas differ. He once sailed to England before anyone knew it existed, bearing ravens as his banner. And when King Aella captured him, Ragnar did not beg for mercy. He merely declared, "My sons will drench your halls in blood." Thus, when Ragnar was cast into the snake pit and sang his death song, what remains memorable is not the manner of his death, but the laughter with which he met it. In revenge, his sons, including Bjorn, raised the great heathen army to invade England, not merely to conquer, but to forge their father's name into the land's destiny. Vikings did not need proof. They had memory. That memory is enough to draw a child's rapt attention through the long winter, learning how Ragnar crossed oceans and how Bjorn returned bearing no old wounds. They say Ragnar forged the path, Bjorn ensured it endured. No tomb has been found for them. Only stones, broken axes, and runes carved on cliffs remain. But that was how they chose to be remembered, not in ashes, but in song.